Hello everybody, who was like God here with a video about King Solomon's wives. That's right, King Solomon and his wives. A very interesting story in the Old Testament and the Bible as a whole. We're going to be unpacking it, what it means, why God let it happen, and the relevance and importance for us today. Now, I'm excited as well because I'm going to be talking about a perspective that I don't think is addressed much when we talk about King Solomon, his wealth, and his woman. So stay tuned till the end. Without further ado, we're going to unpack it first by talking about who was King Solomon. Alright, fellas. King Solomon, he was a very incredibly successful and wealthy king of the Old Testament. His father was the famous King David, and his son is Rehoboam. Now, he was incredible because he was unprecedented in many ways in terms of material wealth, territory, success, peace during his kingdom, especially the wealth. God blessed him with such incredible wealth, which goes to show that material wealth and things aren't sinful or bad in itself, but especially in the Christian walk, following Jesus, you can't expect God to bless you with those things. But they're not bad in themselves, and accumulating wealth for yourself by hard work isn't bad in itself. So that's a little fun fact we can delve into right there. Now, it was revolutionary in a couple ways because, for one, he built the temple in Jerusalem. So, in a sense, you could say he revolutionized Israel's religion, because before then, they had the tabernacle of Moses, which was mobile, and then with Solomon's temple, religion of Yahweh, of God, became centralized in one building in Jerusalem. Now, he was also revolutionary because of all the women he had. If Solomon, you don't know Solomon from the temple that he built, you probably know him because he had 1,000 women around, 700 wives of royal birth, and 300 concubines. The Bible is very clear that Solomon loved foreign women. So the thing is, these women weren't even of the people of Israel. They were pagans, and it got him into a lot of trouble, got him punished by God. Well, you may be thinking, I always thought God was one man and one woman. So if that's so, why would God allow this king, this ancient man of God, to have 700 wives and 300 concubines, 1,000 women and all to sleep with? We're going to get right into it. Let's do it. Alright, so first, if we're going to understand, or rather ask the question, why did God allow this to happen, we have to understand what it means for God to allow something to happen. Understand, God gave us as human beings free will. What that means is we have the conscious ability to make choices. As we speak, I can make a choice to do something good or something bad, something productive, something unproductive, something to harm other people, or something to help other people. Now, just because I do those things doesn't mean it goes back to God, because, well, everything in creation is submitted to God. We have our own free will as consciously human beings. One of the ways we were unique among the animal kingdom is that beyond our instincts, we have conscious choice, that we can do things for pleasure that aren't even beneficial to us or to the thriving of the species. So that's what it is. But to wrap it up, just because God lets something happen doesn't mean he approves of it. And just because God doesn't strike you down with lightning right away doesn't mean judgment isn't coming. That's important to understand, because with Solomon, he did sin against God with all of these women, and in other ways too. We're going to unpack how exactly Solomon sinned, and it's important to understand because judgment did come on Solomon because of what he did. He and his kingdom were cursed, a curse that would be fulfilled after Solomon died, actually, not in his lifetime. We're going to unpack all of this, but first we got to understand exactly what Solomon did wrong. Well, in the first charge, he had way too many wives. Now, Solomon is living under a time which theologians refer to as the Mosaic Covenant. What that basically means is the people of Israel before the time of Christ lived under the law of Moses. God essentially established this system for his people, saying, if you would obey me and obey my rules, you will be my people and I will be your God. All that being said, there are various rules in the Torah and the law of Moses for the ancient people of Israel to follow in that culture, so that they could represent God to the nations. Now, as it pertains to Israel's kings, this is one of the important rules that was given. Deuteronomy 17:17, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So the idea here is that he shouldn't have so many women or so much wealth, material wealth, that his heart turns away from God. Especially if your heart turning away from God involves you turning to other gods, which is what happened in Solomon's case. It's also commanded that a Jewish man, or rather a man from the people of Israel, must marry within his own people. Now this wasn't a racial thing, because we know Gentiles, people who weren't Jewish, so to speak, they could come into the people of God if they converted to Judaism, which basically means if they kept the commandments God gave to Moses and they got circumcised, so on and so on. The reason God prohibits intermarriage is because in that time, if a Jewish man got with a pagan girl, or if an Israelite girl got with a pagan man, 11 times out of 10 it would cause the holy person, the righteous person of God, to go worship other gods. And we see that be fulfilled in Solomon's case. Deuteronomy 7:3-4, you shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. One of the reasons why God, our God, was so unique in that time, which has been observed historically, is that he was very strict about the select worship. In other words, you can only worship God. He did not tolerate you worshiping any other gods, which is Israel's sin over and over and over in the Old Testament, so much so that he promises he would destroy you quickly if you start worshiping other gods. A promise that gets fulfilled in the Old Testament when they're ultimately exiled to Babylon, and then are subjected to world empires, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and so on. And even now, Israel doesn't have a monarchy set up to this day. Now, the only king that was given the right to rule over the Jews is the Messiah, which is promised in the Old Testament scriptures. We ultimately know that to be Jesus. So when God would punish his people, one of the reasons he would never wipe them off of the face of the earth completely is because he would use Israel and her Messiah to restore the whole world back to him. Something that we see fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who brought billions back to worshiping the one true God. Now Solomon broke these 3 rules, and God punished him. Number 1, he had way too many wives, and that's a sin in itself, but he could at least have gotten them from the people of Israel. He sinned a second time when he married pagans who brought him to other gods, and he started worshiping those other gods. And those other gods a lot of the time involved human sacrifice, child sacrifice. So we don't even know Solomon ended up offering some of his kids to these pagan gods in the latter years of his life. But we can see this gets pretty severe. It gets really severe, and because God broke the rules of the covenant, because he was going way beyond what God had allowed and what God tolerated, God did punish him for it. Now, what's interesting is that when God punished Solomon, he never took away the kingdom, or rather the throne of David, forever. He never took that away, because God promised to David, who was Solomon's father, that your throne is going to last forever. Your royal throne over Israel is going to last forever. That's God's promise to David. And the reason God would keep that promise is because it would ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who I believe will be completely fulfilled at the second coming, when he returns and literally reigns, and so on and so on. But God kept the promise of the throne of David. We know he was the Messiah for a number of reasons. So God preserved the throne. He would never take the throne away completely, but God did curse Solomon's kingdom. For one, he said there would be this disastrous split. So understand, at this time, for a period of roughly 120 years, Israel was a united monarchy, meaning the 12 tribes were united under King Saul for 40 years, King David for 40 years, and King Solomon for 40 years. But Solomon started to sin, so God was going to change that. So from that point on, the kingdom of Israel would split into Israel at the north and Judah at the south. Israel would have 10 tribes, and Judah would be primarily Judah, and Benjamin also, I believe. So what we see is it's two separate kingdoms with two distinct monarchies. Judah would be the tribe that the heirs of David, or the sons of David, would rule over, and the of Israel would be a different monarch. But we see the United Kingdom now split into two separate ones, which is the state of Israel for most of the Old Testament. So God did curse Solomon's kingdom, something that wouldn't happen in Solomon's lifetime, but in the lifetime of his son Rehoboam in the 10th century BC. Now, all this being said, we need to understand this because it can be a little confusing. We need to understand that we know Solomon sinned, but the reason Solomon sinned was because he had so many women. Because understand, having more than one wife was allowed in the Old Testament. So the fact that he had more than one wife, if he kept it that way, wouldn't have been bad, but he had way too many that it was going beyond the limit of what God had allowed for his people of Israel. Also, you have to understand that they were pagan and they caused them to worship other gods. Those were also sins Solomon committed. But in terms of marrying more than one woman, that in itself isn't sinful. Rather, it was that he had so many women that he was breaking God's covenant. So we have to understand, because this is where it can get a little trippy. God's design has always been one man and one woman. We look back to Adam and Eve, and we see that it was God's design that a man should leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, they should be fruitful, and multiply, bear children on the beautiful earth God has made. That was the ideal design for marriage. That being said, God allowed for polygamy, which means more than one spouse, more than one wife. He allowed that under the law of Moses. He allowed that for his people back in the Old Testament. And you gotta ask yourself why. Now, if you actually do some digging, it's a pretty interesting answer. Now, we have to understand the cultural context. In the Old Testament, in Old Testament times, the law of Moses, the Torah as many refer to it, it was coming into a culture and a context where polygamy was already going on. So God, knowing the future, knowing what was going on and what would probably happen anyways, he allowed certain things to happen which were in his ideal plan or in his ideal design. That's why in the same breath, God allowed divorce under the Old Testament law, although we know that was never God's original heart for marriage. A couple scriptures I'm going to give you about this. Leviticus 18:18. Neither shall thou take a wife to her sister, to vex her, to uncover her nakedness, besides the other in her lifetimes. So when you read this, the context is suggesting literal sisters. So in other words, polygamy is allowed. God allowed that for his people, but there's a prohibition. There's limits. There's standards. Even though more than one wife is allowed, you're not going to take two sisters, and you're not going to sleep with two sisters at the same time, in the same lifetime, uncovering the nakedness of both sisters. God did not allow that to happen. Exodus 21 verses 9 to 10. And if he have betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. If he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. So in the context of Exodus 21, the poor family is selling their daughter as a slave to a rich man. Say your family can't afford a normal wedding, so you're giving your daughter off to a rich man. Oh shoot. And essentially this is saying if the rich man gives the girl to his son, and the son takes another wife, his responsibility to the first wife isn't going to go away. So if you actually read between the lines, we read this with our modern lens and think that it's weird, but it's actually protecting woman. And that time, poor woman who get with a man, the man's duty to his wife isn't going to disappear even if he gets another one. Now this also shows, very important, that in the Old Testament, it was the responsibility of a man to provide for his wife and his family. That's a very interesting thing that I want to point out. Finally, Deuteronomy 17:17, the verse I mentioned at the first, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excess of silver or gold. God is talking about the future kings of Israel, and when you say that you shall not acquire many wives, it implies that a few wives is fine. For example, David had 18 wives, and he's never chastised or condemned by God for it in the Old Testament. The problem was that Solomon has so many, and not only that, like I said before, they were Gentiles, and they caused him to worship other gods. So he sinned on 3 layers, layer after layer. So this shows that God's original design was one man and one woman, but having more than one wife was allowed under the law in the Old Testament. So why is that? This is where it gets interesting. Understand that the law was not a perfect moral system. The New Testament teaches this, that it wasn't perfect, and also just secular history. If we look at that time, in that context, the law was never meant to be a perfect system. It was never like laws we think of today. Rather, God was meeting the people of Israel where they were at, and he was giving them this sort of guide so that in that culture, in that context, they could show all these other nations about how to worship the one true God, how to be the true people of God to all the surrounding nations. So we see that, like I said before, God made certain provisions in the law that he allowed things that weren't his ideal design because it wasn't a perfect system. Jesus teaches this in Matthew 19. So we have to consider all the factors about why and when. And this is beautiful to think, because when Jesus came, he fulfilled the law. We've heard this verse, but maybe we never thought about what it really meant. He fulfilled the scriptures as a whole, the Hebrew scriptures as a whole, the things that are appointed to him. But when he comes on the scene fulfilling the law of Moses, he appeals to the first creation design. In other words, when Jesus comes on the scene, he goes all the way back to Adam and Eve and says, hey, this is how marriage should be. And now believers in Christ are called to handle marriage and sex the way that it was at first. One man and one woman in fully matrimony. So it's cool because if you think about it abstractly, it comes full circle. Now men, this is my opinion, because it is true that if you look at history, that men with wealth, power, and status have always had more than one woman. Now that doesn't mean it's right, but it is true. And hypergamy is a real thing. All things considered, biologically we know women are designed to try to get the best man out of the group. So when you look at the story of Solomon, I think that there's a practical application for us men that isn't talked about in church so much. Basically, I believe that every man should improve himself to the best of his ability if given the opportunity. Put God first, put the kingdom of God first, of course, but improve yourself physically, financially, in terms of maturity, so on and so on. Spiritually, of course, improve yourself in every area that's immediately relevant as a man, and then get to a point where more women would naturally want to be with you. Get to a point where a woman would want to be your wife, and then when you get to that point, you find a woman, a godly girl, who you can have children with, and so on and so on. So instead of sleeping around and going with hundreds of girls, when you're a really good-looking and stable guy, get to that point, put in the hard work, and then find one girl to make your wife. That's how I think these things should go. There's definitely an application there to improve ourselves to the best of our ability as men with the short time we have under the sun. Because there are certain things that women are going to be innately attracted to. Women are attracted to leaders, after all. If you're not a leader in what God called the man to be for the home, then it's not going to be so hot. It's not going to work out so great when you're on the dating field. So just some practical advice that I think we can take when we look at Solomon's story. Now, all this being said, Solomon is a very interesting story in the Bible, but we got to remember when we read it, and whenever we do what we got to do in life, we always got to operate in God's standard. So I want to make sure that's clear. Now, all this being said, Solomon is a very interesting story in the Bible. That's why God let him have all those wives, let in the sense that it happened, but God certainly didn't approve of it. He got punished for it. The kingdom split in the 10th century BC. Polygamy was allowed in the Old Testament, but the Old Testament law was not a perfect system. It was a system that was ultimately pointing to Christ, to the perfect man, and to the one who would free us from sin and help us with our sin problem. And when he came on the scene, he goes back to Genesis 2, one man, one woman, and now all believers are called to hold to that standard. It's amazing in summary because it comes full circle. God bless all of y'all, and I'll see you in the next one.